Many think that reading is a solitary act. Readers curl up in armchairs, in front of cozy fireplaces, or snuggled under the covers with flashlights. But the act of reading is social, especially academic reading. Students grow as readers when we intentionally make academic reading more collaborative. I'm Allison Poindexter, and I'm going to talk to you briefly about the socio-cultural theory of reading and its connection to the instructional practices of close reading. I'll discuss Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, and I'll share some examples of how teachers might leverage the collaborative nature of reading into scaffolded practice toward independence. The sociocultural theory of reading states that reading is a collaborative practice, a partnership between the student and the teacher, where the teacher acts as the more experienced peer or mentor, guiding the reader in advancing their skills. There is a relationship between this collaboration and the scaffolding that occurs within reading instruction. The best, most masterful teachers balance the needs of the student with the demands of the curriculum to produce results, greater success and confidence in reading, increased knowledge of the world, and increased pleasure in reading. Now, what is that relationship? Most students of educational or human psychology are familiar with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. I've seen the ZPD in action in my own educational endeavors. There have been many times when I have deemed a task too difficult. Often math was involved. In those cases, I didn't even attempt the task. Or there have been instances when a task has been far too easy. Look through this list of names and highlight all of the Allisons. I'm bored thinking about those tasks. So the ZPD suggests that we learn or develop when we are challenged beyond what we can do by ourselves and we are given support. That's the point of school, to give students problem-solving work that skilled teachers can support students to accomplish. However, it is important to remember that Vygotsky wrote pages and pages of research, and the ZPD is contained in only a few of them. We must challenge ourselves to not oversimplify his research or make assumptions about it. Now, I am no Vygotsky scholar, so I will limit my discussion to what it might look like for educators to engage some of his ideas, namely the social elements of learning. The way I see the sociocultural theory of reading at work in the classroom is when teachers build a culture of collaboration and scaffolding in their classrooms. Teachers can create reading tasks and build a reading culture in which students build their capacity as readers and thinkers by completing increasingly cognitively demanding tasks, but not on their own. A teacher could serve as a peer or a mentor, or create situations in which students serve in that capacity for one another. Teachers can teach their students how to serve in that role and will eventually remove those scaffolds. As teachers prepare for this work, we must keep the end in mind. What are our goals for the lesson, for the unit, and for our students in the course and beyond? I want my students to read and understand the text, participate in oral and written discussions to enhance their comprehension, and apply their knowledge gained. However, I know it is impossible to achieve all of those goals with one task. I must consider many factors when I build assignments to move students toward my big goals. I must consider my students' reading abilities, their interest, and their current capacity for the task, among other things. When I start looking at the narrow tasks, I can't forget that big picture. And sometimes I'm afraid that teachers do. They do forget the big picture. So what does this look like in the secondary literacy classroom. I invite you to put your student hat on for a moment as I introduce a reading task. So let's consider this example. I'm going to share with you a number of examples of close reading tasks with increasingly complex tasks and increasingly complex texts. Read this text. As a reader, how did you encounter this text? Take a moment to be metacognitive for me. You might have read the title and the labels on the graph. You might have made a personal connection to Taylor Swift. Honestly, I'm hoping for that. I'm hoping for a positive personal connection. Maybe you're looking at other artists in the list and noticing that Taylor Swift is the highest female artist on that list. Maybe you're calculating the percentage of songs not by Taylor Swift. You'll notice that that's pretty simple math. Or you might be frustrated with me because I didn't give you a direction. I just told you to read this text. You might have been frustrated that I picked a graph and didn't tell you how to read a graph. You might have been frustrated that I picked Taylor Swift. Now, think about how a 12-year-old might feel, or a 16-year-old. I wonder how often we do this to our students, especially as secondary literacy teachers. I can't tell you the number of texts I've put in front of students and expected them to encounter them the way that I would, without giving them the direction or the skills or the scaffolds that they would need to be successful. And how many students I've seen to give up on that work. Or I've given students tasks that they couldn't complete because I didn't think carefully enough about what I was asking them to do. If I'm thinking about my big picture goal, that students are more confident, competent readers, I need to be thinking about how to accomplish that with every single task I put in front of students. So let me show you some alternative tasks that pick up some of the cues of the socio-cultural theory of reading. This first example asks students to notice and wonder. This is a very simple entry point into close reading. There aren't right or wrong answers, so a student might feel safe to explore and ask questions. Plus, students are prompted to make their observations visible using a graphic organizer. If I'm a student in this class, I might notice that this section here at the bottom of this graph over here is green, but that's all Taylor Swift. And if this whole chart represents all songs on the Billboard Top 100, that's a lot of Taylor Swift. I might notice that the Beatles are artists that really don't have they're not going to come out with another album. So it's really possible that Taylor Swift might continue to move up on this list. I might notice that Drake and Jay-Z are hip hop artists. And I might wonder, like, why are two hip hop artists so high up on this list? I don't know. It's safe for me to ask those questions. It's reasonable for me to ask those questions. If I'm a 16-year-old, if I'm a 12-year-old, I might not know who Barbra Streisand is. I might not even know who Bruce Springsteen is. That would break my heart if I was their teacher. But I might offer students an opportunity to do some research. So the next kind of step for students would be to fill in a graphic organizer. It's not necessary, but I love a graphic organizer. I love that it makes thinking visible. So let's talk about my second example. I've shared this tool many, many, many times before. This is another safe way for students to practice close reading. This is the scaffold of metacognitive markers. It is a scaffold of a reminder of how students are to engage with the text. This tool reminds students that it is appropriate to stop and think when they have a question or comment about what they are reading. Plus, this example reminds us that we should be sharing our responses with a partner who might offer additional insights. I use this tool to teach students how to annotate text. I think sometimes students don't feel comfortable writing on a text as if it is precious or if it is too special or too important to kind of engage with in that way. So, I let students write their question marks. I let students put asterisks on their texts, and I often show them the work that I do on my own readings, so that they know that as a mentor reader that I do the same. But I've only given them 5 marks to make, so that feels really manageable. There's not like a list of 15 marks that they have to make. No, they're limited to 5, and they're very manageable. These are very manageable marks. Now, example number 3 is perhaps the most complex tool because there are so many layers of responsibility, but this still offers scaffolding of what to do during each reading. So this is the phases of close reading tool. The first phase, students are to read for general understanding. They're perhaps reading to summarize or to develop a central idea or to determine a central idea. They're looking up organization and so on. Then in phase 2, they're zooming in and thinking about vocabulary or words. They're thinking about genre. They're looking at text structure and syntax. In phase 3, they're zooming out and they're thinking about text quality. They're thinking about author credibility and text-to-text connections. This is really a pretty sophisticated tool, and I wouldn't suggest to use this unless students have had multiple exposures to close reading, and they've had many, many opportunities to kind of engage with that practice, because this really is kind of an overwhelming task for someone who is still struggling to read a text the first time. And perhaps this isn't a tool for a graph. Perhaps students are using this for to close read a paragraph or even close read a full text or a poem. Now, I've shown some examples for how to scaffold the task, but there are also ways to scaffold the text. We saw an example of close reading a graph. We did that together, but there are other ways to make this task increasingly difficult. Teachers can select a picture for students to close read, a single sentence from a selection, or a whole text. The object here is that students experience success with increasingly complex texts. In conclusion, socio-cultural theory of reading prompts teachers to build collaboration and scaffolding into their instructional practices. In order to build increasingly complex reading tasks for students and to build the capacity for independence in those tasks. This is an ongoing practice, but one we can grow with. Thanks for listening.